So Phillis Wheatley is a really fascinating figure. I actually never learned anything about Phillis Wheatley. I mean, maybe she was mentioned in passing, but nothing that ever stuck with me about Phillis until I was in grad school. And Phillis Wheatley, one of the things that makes her so kind of amazing is that she is the first Black poet in the United States, long before before the United States even is the United States. She was brought to the United States as a young girl, kidnapped from her family in Africa. She was only about 8 years old when the Wheatleys purchased her as a slave in Boston. And they then discovered that she was quite the genius. She very quickly learned English and then learned to read and write, and then started to write poetry. She was lucky enough that the Wheatleys were wealthy enough that they didn't need to rely on her labor. And so they allowed her to pursue kind of those talents that she had and to write poetry. Her first published poem was when she was something like 13 years old. And then it was in her later teens that she wrote a whole book of published poetry. But she's a really kind of fascinating figure. Her poetry, some of it can be a little dull, but some of it can also be very moving. And she is, if you haven't picked up on it already, the first image in the header for this class. I picked her because she is a very kind of little known figure in Black history in the United States, but also very important, I think. She was the first published African American and one of the first women to be published in the colonies that would become the United States. And she was living right around the time of the American Revolution. We only, unfortunately, have her first works. Her later whole book of poetry that she wrote when she was an adult and a free woman who had married a free Black man who was a lawyer and someone who was very much kind of challenging the perceptions of what a Black man should be in that time. So her as, as free woman, as a wife, as a mother, as someone who wasn't just kind of the protected little girl doing what she was told, all of that poetry was lost. And I always wonder what was in that second book of poems and how it may have been different, perhaps a bit more forceful or radical now that she wasn't someone's property once she was actually free. Unfortunately, it was lost, although I always kind of hope, who knows, one day maybe that book will be found. It was never actually published. The publishers kind of turned it down. I think she was a little bit more exciting when she was kind of this young child doing these things. And then when she was older, it wasn't quite as, exciting anymore for audiences. This is a picture that was actually done by Scipio Moorhead, who was also a Black artist at the time. And Phillis Wheatley actually does have a statue in Boston. So if any of you want to go kind of search it out. But you can read the whole article, find out a little bit more about her story. I really love this writing by June Jordan because it's a poet writing about a poet. And I think she really does a great job of telling Phillis Wheatley's story and kind of why she is so important.